One of our patients just had a baby, and we had no idea she was pregnant.
Ever since that dramatic December day played out at Hacienda Healthcare, a lot has happened. But now we're getting a look at the official police report from the Hacienda investigation. We'll warn you, parts of it are disturbing. For example, when the victim, who police confirm was unable to talk, move, swallow, or breathe normally, was brought to the hospital, a doctor said she showed signs of being sexually active and having given birth before, suggesting this may not have been the only time the woman had a baby. Interviews with Hacienda nurses and employees indicate the woman's stomach had been bloated for 4 months, and she had no menstruation for 6 months. A doctor ordered an ultrasound, but the test was declined by the diagnostic company. The police report even says that in 2002, the victim was part of a group of patients who were believed to have been touched inappropriately.
Got a DNA, have the person in custody, and he's in jail.
And then there's the accused, Nathan Sutherland, arrested after a DNA match. In the report, employees say after the baby was born, Sutherland called in sick for the next 2 to 3 Sundays and told one employee he was going through a rough time and asked her to pray for him.
And I will tell you something that as an investigator, as a member of our community, that I look at as important is this was an employee rather than a stranger who made his way into the facility.
Police say Sutherland was a licensed practical nurse who had direct contact with the victim. Through a court order, they got DNA from Sutherland and say it matched with the victim's baby.
Mr. Sutherland, may I have your full name, please?
Nathan Darcy Sutherland.
And your date of birth?
3/31/1982.
Standing next to his attorney in court today, a judge reads off the serious charges he's facing. A prosecutor, off camera, says the state will not settle for anything less than prison time.
The defendant sexually assaulted a very vulnerable adult who had no capacity to resist, no capacity to cry out, no capacity to do anything other than be subject to what the defendant did to her.
One of our concerns is were there other victims or how many times this occurred. We may not know how many times this occurred.
The only allegation at this point is that there's DNA.
So do you believe the client is innocent?
I believe the client is entitled to due process and proof beyond a reasonable doubt, as all defendants are.
In court, Gregan told the judge there's no proof Sutherland is the guy.
There's no direct evidence that Mr. Sutherland has committed these acts. I know at this point there is DNA. Mr. Sutherland will have a right and have his own DNA expert.
So what can you tell us about the DNA? You were talking...
I can't tell you anything, but I haven't received discovery, but there's an allegation of DNA. That's all I can tell you at this point.
And so you guys do plan to challenge that?
Well, we plan to have it tested, for sure.
So you will run your own DNA tests?
Oh, correct.
Judge set Sutherland's bond at $500,000 cash, which his attorney argued is excessive since Sutherland does not have a criminal history.
All right, as we stated, this is a sexual assault case. So there is a victim. That victim is alive, but let's talk a little bit more about her. Here's some information that we have at this point. 29-year-old Native American woman, intellectually disabled for nearly a decade, not in a coma or vegetative state as previously reported by some news outlets. So a very sympathetic and unique victim here, but the question I have is what role will she play during the course of this trial? Let's bring in someone who can answer that question for us. Joining us from Phoenix, Arizona, the attorney who represented Jodi Arias and hates her more than you do, Kirk Nurmi, back with us. Kirk, great to see you.
Vinny, great to see you. Happy New Year, my friend.
Happy New Year. This case is very difficult, but you have you think about who the victim is here. Someone who was incapacitated, the most vulnerable type of victim. But as we move this into a courtroom, what role in this trial will the victim play?
You know, obviously she's a very sympathetic victim, and I think prosecutors are going to play on that. Some of those aspects of her limited no communicative ability, limited ambulatory abilities. But I think ultimately this is going to come down to DNA, because what we're talking about here is the baby and the connection to the baby, to the defendant, and as well as the victim.
Well, let me ask you, does the jury ever get to see her? Should the jury get to see her? She is the victim here.
Well, that's a great and interesting question, Vinny. But I don't know that she would be able to provide anything to the jury. Maybe the prosecutors will try to get a videotape that demonstrates her state, but I don't necessarily know that they need to do that. I don't know that if, and I happen to work with the prosecutor who's doing this case, and I think he's pretty straightforward, and I think he is the type that's going to focus on the DNA and maybe have some medical experts talk about her condition and her physical condition as a way to bringing that emotion into the courtroom without actually bringing her physically into the room.
Yeah, and I understand it would bring a level of emotion, but ultimately it's what the case is about. It's about what happened to this woman. And for me, as a former prosecutor, I don't know how I would necessarily try this case, but I would think very deeply about, okay, I want the truth, and I want the jury to understand the truth, and I want the jury to understand what happened and who it happened to. I mean, from my perspective, I almost feel like in our system of justice that the jury should know who she is. The jury should have an opportunity to understand and see her, whether it's through a video or whether it's through her actually in the courtroom.
Yeah, I mean, from a medical standpoint, we don't know what that would mean or what that would do to her. I imagine, especially when we're talking about a trial in the COVID era, that the alternative, if I was the prosecutor, would be some sort of videotape or some sort of description, maybe from her family, maybe from other nurses, that sort of thing. But I think in this instance, this might be one of those rare exceptions where we don't hear as much from the victim as a prosecutor might like, because it's just not feasible. And I think the elements of what she went through and her condition are enough to convey the emotion with perhaps some video to make her a part of it.
How about the baby? The baby, as you mentioned, it's amazing. A baby is a piece of evidence, but a baby is much, much more. We understand that. Should this jury see the baby?
Yeah, Vinny, that's another tough question.
I'm hitting you with some tough ones tonight, Kirk.
Now 2 years old. You're talking about bringing a 2-year-old into the courtroom. Now, obviously, a 2-year-old can't testify. We know that. Would we be bringing the baby in as a quote-unquote exhibit? And that seems unfathomable in this case, right? There's a lot about this case that seems unfathomable. But again, I think this might be a situation where the prosecutor might use pictures or that sort of thing to give some life to this case. But, that's a double-edged sword, because that's obviously something that could cut both ways. And I think Mr. Cohen, knowing him a little bit, is going to be someone who's going to be pretty straightforward and fixate on the DNA and the horrific actions that were a product of that.
Yeah. I guess I'm just a different type of prosecutor. And the reason I bring it all up, again, is just to make sure the jury fully understands what happened here. And I think you can do it through images, though, rather than bringing them in the courtroom. Kirk Nurmi, always great to have you on the program. Please come back very soon. Let's talk to our booking unit and say, listen, we need more Kirk Nurmi, right?
Well, that would be great, Vinny. I always love hanging out with you and talking the cases that are on everybody's mind. So it's always a pleasure.
All right. Thanks so much, Kirk. We'll see you. All right.
All right.